Red Bull have had a disappointing start to the 2026 World Championship, to say the least. Max Verstappen and Isaac Hadjar do seem closely matched, which is quite good considering there's been the second driver curse at Red Bull ever since the departure of Daniel Ricciardo in 2018. However, the fundamental problem is the car is simply not fast enough. Something wrong with the package, whether it's the engine or the chassis, and most things point to this being a chassis problem. And in this video, I'm going to predict exactly what Red Bull can do this season or in this regulation cycle going forward, and what exactly is the fundamental issue. So it's going to be very hard to predict what the performance of these vehicles are going to be going forward, simply because the rate of development in these new regulations with very new technology, very new technical specifications that have been introduced, that the teams, even though they have the state-of-the-art facilities, the best engineers, aerodynamicists, drivers, data analysis in the world, because it's quite a novel regulation change. Active Aero, obviously, essentially a 50-50 electric to split. It's going to be a big jump from the times we have now, from the understanding of the car they have now. Even Mercedes, who has emerged as a dominant hegemon, albeit Ferrari has been quite close to Mercedes in terms of, especially in the first few laps, because Ferrari very ingeniously have developed their car tailored to these new regulations with the small turbo, which has proven very effective. I think that in terms of engineering, Ferrari and Mercedes have been very closely matched, but Mercedes does seem to have the advantage purely because their engine management is so effective. But I think Ferrari can certainly compete for the championship if there is some kind of technical directive whereby that is nerfed somewhat. The Mercedes engine is not as powerful as it is now because it's limited in some shape or form. Whereas the Ferrari has a clear development direction. They've got a car with immense traction, low speed corner capability, and their small turbo is in synthesis with this sort of the small turbo provides amazing launches at the race start. However, it also is part of a chassis generally that is extremely good at traction and cornering, which means that I think that even if there is no mid-season regulation change or technical directive that does nerf Mercedes, I think Ferrari will be very strong in the least energy intensive tracks that has a lot of cornering, namely high downforce tracks such as Monaco, Singapore, Hungary. Obviously, Hungary has that one long main straight, but that is negligible compared to tracks like Australia, Monza, Spa, which are either power tracks and or energy intensive tracks. But I digress. Mercedes and Ferrari seem to be in a great position. It will be an exciting development battle between the two, but nevertheless, Mercedes does have the advantage and seems to hold the cards. But when it comes to Red Bull, I think, well, it's an objective fact that Red Bull are not in a good position. However, I think that all is not lost. As I said at the start of the video, this regulation change, this regulation cycle is going to see rapid development. And the last one, that is exactly what we saw. In fact, it was sustained throughout the 4 years of that regulation change that we had. In the second half of the ground effect era, we saw McLaren go from being a backmarker car in early 2023 to later that year being the second best car. And then in 2024 having the fastest car, and in 2025 a dominant car. Albeit Red Bull did make a comeback near the end and arguably had the fastest car in many of those circuits. The fact remains that that rate of development that McLaren had, and Red Bull coming back after a few years or months of stagnation, meant that there's always room to improve. I think here Red Bull have room to improve in a number of ways. The two main ways they can improve, I think, is via the chassis. I think actually the Ford Red Bull powertrain is a very strong engine. It's arguably the second best, which you may be shocked to hear because the Ferrari is so competitive, and of course the Mercedes is number one. in terms of the best engine, I think Ferrari at the moment seems to have a better understanding of what they want to do, which is quite exciting for them because they seem to have a very good direction, especially with development as well, because they've got this small turbo and it's paying dividends for them on the race start. A car that is simply very good at cornering and traction, but obviously with fundamental flaws like tyre wear, which is also what Red Bull is facing. However, obviously pre-season testing is not representative, but we did see in pre-season testing that Red Bull produced the highest top speed of any other team in, I believe it was the first day of the Bahrain test. And I think it showed in Australia, which was a very energy intensive track, and Hadjar qualified P3. And I think had Verstappen not had this problem, which was very likely catalyzed by their chassis issues, a fundamental instability, unbalance in the car that caused the rear axle to totally lock, Verstappen would have probably qualified a few tenths ahead of Hadjar, maybe even if we say 1 or 2 or about the same. He is half a second of Merc, but nevertheless, it puts them ahead of the Ferraris and the McLarens in an energy-intensive track, which points to the Red Bull Ford powertrain being quite a competitive engine, especially considering their chassis problems. In terms of peak power, and I think energy management is pretty good. But the chassis is a big problem, and obviously I digressed for a little bit, but in the latter half of this video, starting now, I'm going to discuss what specific chassis problems they're going to fix. So as I touched upon, firstly, it's the lack of balance that is affecting both Verstappen and Hadjar, and I think that this is not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is the one I'm going to go into next, but I think this is still a massive problem, arguably their second biggest problem, because the car might have underlying pace, which I think right now, because of the next problem I will discuss, it doesn't have that. However, if it does, the problem is that it's such an unbalanced car that they're not able to extract pace simply because they don't have the confidence. The rear is sliding everywhere. You know, they're getting understeer. In the first few corners of Sector 1 alone of the lap, Verstappen was losing several tenths to the front runners. So this is a big problem that Red Bull can fix if they understand the car, what is causing this instability, etc. But that goes on to the actual biggest problem that I've been alluding to, but I haven't discussed at all, and that is the Red Bull is massively overweight. Now, we've got information that is not officially released, but some fans in the VIP zones in the Chinese Grand Prix have actually received information, obviously by taking pictures because Formula One wasn't able to conceal this. The Red Bull is about 20 kilos overweight relative to its rivals, namely the Ferrari. And the Mercedes is probably around where Ferrari is. So that 20 kilos is probably worth close to a second, even if we do a second a lap. So even if we do a conservative estimate, then that's like 6 tenths a lap at least, I would say. If we do like a normal moderate estimate, it's probably like 8 tenths. And probably an aggressive, optimistic estimate, if Red Bull manages to shed off those 20 kilos of being overweight, then it's probably worth about a second a lap. And actually, even in China, where Red Bull had these problems with car balance, it brings them literally right neck and neck with the Mercedes. So even if we actually take the conservative estimate, the Red Bull, even with their balance issues, becomes neck and neck with the Ferrari. Now, I'm implicitly assuming now that the balance issues and the weight issues are not related. I think they are related, so that implicit assumption is incorrect. I think they're related, but in many ways they're also separate because they can be tackled in different ways. However, the weight issues are certainly affecting the balance, especially with the understeer. And then if you're getting understeer and then suddenly the rear is unstable, therefore causing oversteer, that's really bad, not only for pure pace but also for throughout the race. You've got stuff like tire wear, and you just can't have consistency because the car is behaving unexpectedly lap after lap. So I think Red Bull needs to focus mainly on shedding the weight so they actually get the underlying pace to where it needs to be, which I think they have quite a high ceiling. So I think there is a lot of promise even in this quite dire situation in Red Bull, because from what we've seen so far, what I mentioned, the Australia race, I think in terms of the engine, Red Bull is pretty close to Mercedes and Ferrari, close enough not to worry about that, but it's certainly a chassis problem. Once they can cut the weight by at least, a dozen kilos, it is a lot. But I think even that will probably make up like half a second, I think, close to half a second at least, which will bring them comfortably close to the Ferraris. And on top of that, in tandem, if they can fix their balance issues, that will comfortably bring them not only even closer to the Ferraris, but perhaps on par or closer to the Mercedes, because especially over a race distance, because they'll have less of these tire wear issues that have been plaguing them. Also, the fundamental underlying pace issues that saw them fall into the midfield battle with Haas and Alpine. But I think, as I said, the development battle is going to be very fast. They have more cost cap this season, firstly due to inflationary pressure around the world, but also, I guess, just more money to spend to invest in research and development for this upcoming season. Now, there's a bit of a break onto Japan, not too much. I believe it's about 2 weeks. And then after that, there's a month until Miami, because obviously Jeddah and Bahrain have been cancelled. So I think Red Bull really can make a big turnaround. Will it be enough to win the title? I don't want to say no, but right now Mercedes are definitely the firm favourite for the constructors. I think the only way either Ferrari or another team, it's most likely going to be Ferrari, because they have a very strong platform now. Their floor is high and their ceiling is very high as well. But the same goes for Mercedes. I think for Mercedes to not win this title, it would really take something big like a technical directive, because both Russell and Antonelli look very competitive. Especially Antonelli, he's sort of, obviously the race starts from Antonelli need a bit of work, but when he delivers, like obviously the sprint race, it was an issue, but in the race and in the qualifying, of course, he was imperious. He delivered for Mercedes, obviously with a dominant car, but delivered when they needed, because Russell had that issue. And Russell was out of position for most of the race. So again, I'm digressing, but that's simply to put a bit of context of where I think Red Bull can be. When it comes to Red Bull, obviously they're nowhere near fighting for the championship, because they can't even fight for a podium. They could have done so possibly in Australia, but I think that's still a long shot because of their chassis problems, compounded with the fact that Ferrari's engine is suited for race starts, which would mean even if Verstappen started at the front, he probably would have lost out, which is more likely than not, because obviously not just because of the Ferraris, but also because Verstappen has been bogging down in the start more often than not, which I think is another problem Red Bull need to sort of analyze. Because it doesn't seem to be a problem for Hadjar, so I don't think it's an inherent engine problem. But I think once Red Bull can fix these balance issues, obviously, I think predominantly coming from their being severely overweight, I think that they can become quite competitive. They'll have a car that both Verstappen and Hadjar can extract a lot from. Because I think right now, Verstappen and Hadjar are probably one of the best driver lineups. I would even actually put that driver lineup ahead of the McLaren. Probably even ahead of the Mercedes, because I think Hadjar has the edge over Antonelli, Verstappen has the edge over Russell, albeit Russell is an incredible driver. But the Ferrari, I think this year has the best driver lineup, and I think it's showing because they're really keeping the Mercedes on their toes, extracting the most out of their car, and Hamilton is back to his best, pretty much on par with Leclerc. There's barely anything to separate them, and we saw in China, much like in the latter half of Australia, Hamilton seemed to have the edge on tyre wear. Obviously, situational factors do contribute to that, but we see Hamilton's experience and sheer driving ability kick in, and it's exciting to see. But I think Red Bull, there's certainly a lot of room for improvement, which I think they can do mostly because I think they are aware of their problems. I actually don't think Red Bull do not look super worried. I think they know what the problems are. Even though China looked like a step back from Australia, I think that there's certainly opportunity for Red Bull to improve, definitely, because they've done it before. They did it literally last year, and a lot of time to go this year. As I said, very fast-paced regulation cycle. So we'll see. I think I haven't touched upon really what I think of these regulations in this video because it's not as relevant. It is obviously relevant to the regulation discussion, but this video was primarily focused on performance rather than, stuff like raceability, excitement, etc. So that's for another video, but I think Red Bull fans, Max fans should put their mind to ease because the team knows what they're doing. Obviously, Mercedes and Ferrari seem to have like a gargantuan gap to them, but this can easily be closed significantly because I think Red Bull have a lot of limiting factors. Mercedes and Ferrari do not have limiting factors, so their rate of development will be slower than the Red Bull. When Red Bull gets rid of their limiting factors, they'll do a massive jump. And then after that, it's going to be, rapidly developing, same rate as Mercedes and Ferrari. So I think these limiting factors are probably worth close to a second. And once Red Bull get rid of them, they'll be very competitive. So I think not to worry. I think they're working hard on this. And I'm excited to see what all the teams can do throughout the season. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.